Welcome everybody on Zoom, and to those of you who braved the weather to get here. So what is Neo and Post-Impressionism? Last week we finished Impressionism. We saw that it was primarily defined in France and that there were German interpretations of it and American interpretations. They weren't the same. They all developed their own style. But now we're moving into the 80s and 90s. Oh, you need one, Bonnie? No problem. This period where a great many things are all happening at the same time. I mean, so far, everything we've looked at chronologically. In other words, each week, what we look at comes after what we saw the week before. And that's still true today. But for the rest of the classes, understand from here on, all of these things are happening at the same time. There's no longer just one thing following another. And that's true from this point on, like right up to today. Many things are happening at the same time. And this is like the first decades where we find that happening. So as movements, both Neo-Impressionism and Post-Impressionism have one thing in common, and that is they are made up of artists who are responding to Impressionism. That's where the name comes from. Neither of these is actually a style per se, especially not Post-Impressionism. The artists are all responding to Impressionism, and they come after it. The first group, Neo, they were seen as the saviors of Impressionism. They were going to bring the new Impressionism, and they were going to save us from this horrible dead end of Impressionism, because that's how people certainly saw it in the 80s, as we talked about last week. The Post-Impressionists weren't seen as saviors of Impressionism. They were more openly rejecting and acting against it. And one thing we'll talk about in all these artists is what they believed was wrong with Impressionism and how they are going to find a way to correct that error. And they're all going to see different things. They all think different things were wrong with it, and therefore they're all going to do different things. But what ties them together is their relationship to Impressionism, their rejection of it, and what they learned from it, and how they're going to correct those problems. Now, Neo, the first group we're going to talk about, were sometimes referred to as the scientific Impressionists. And there is a reason for that, and that's because they're the first artists that are going to quite scientifically and analytically use real color theory. The Impressionists worked with a lot of color theory, but they were doing it totally intuitively. They were looking at the world, and this is what they were seeing. Now in the 80s, we're getting people analyzing color, writing books about color. And so it's what was considered a scientific approach to color. So that's why they were at the time called scientific Impressionists. We don't really use the term today. The new salon, the Salon des Indépendants, started in 1884. This is a big group. This isn't a small group. They're the ones that are going to replace those so-called Impressionist exhibitions. There's a couple of years of overlap, but then the so-called Impressionists just stop and the Independence takes over. They're a big spring exhibition opportunity every spring, and everybody's welcome there. So this is a very important change that opens up to both the realists and the symbolists. Another exhibition that was important that lasted for a while was the 20, or Les 20. Les 20, as it was known, was in Brussels, and it was a very important exhibition. It's where many of these artists showed. It's the exhibition where Van Gogh sold his one work. I mean, most people heard the story. Van Gogh sold one work in his life. We'll look at that work, and he sold it from this exhibition in Brussels. Continuous opportunities. There's no shortage of opportunities to show your art now throughout the 80s and 90s and from this point on. And all of these artists are so important because they are the ones who define the 20th century. Everything that happens in the 20th century comes from the artists we're going to talk about today and next week, both. So the first person I want to talk about is Georges Seurat. He was known as a neo-impressionist. He believed very strongly that Impressionism lacked a kind of structure. He thought it was too casual, too careless, too haphazard, and he wanted to bring back good French art. And when they said good French art, they meant classical art, something timeless. And there's nothing less timeless than Impressionism. Impressionism was all about the fleeting moment. It was about right now and then move on. He didn't like that. He wanted to go back to something much more classical. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to go back and make neoclassical art or Renaissance art. He's going to be a modernist, but he's going to find a way to imbue modern art with this more traditional, timeless quality. So there is a sort of nationalist sense to classical art because the French identify with it. Also, almost all the artists we're going to talk about today are realists. They're still continuing that vein. We're going to see developing in the 80s and 90s two traditions in art. One, the realist tradition, which has been going on since mid-century, which these artists are going to continue. And by that, I mean, they look at and depict the world they live in. That's what a realist does. They don't invent things. They look at the world and that's what they paint. And that's going to continue with all of these artists. The other trend is the anti-realist trend, which we will get to next week. That's the symbolists and all sorts of different groups of artists who believe that's the wrong approach to art and that you should be inventing things, making them up. Images should come from the artist's imagination, and it's a backlash against decades of realism. We'll talk more about their argument and why they believe that's true a little bit later. So let's take a look at an early work by Seurat. I mentioned the art dealer, Felix Fénéon. He was their greatest supporter. He showed their work. He was a patron of their work. All of the neo-impressionists were also linked politically. This is the group that were all anarchists. They were socialists, they believed in anarchism, and that message is in a great many of their works. I'll remind you of this in a little bit, but Pissarro, who we looked at last time, briefly went through a neo-impressionist phase when he was pulled into the anarchist movement. So the connection between anarchism and this style cannot be overstated. When people saw this style and pointillist technique, they thought of a political point of view. Yeah.
Are you thinking of, are we just talking about anarchists in painting or in government?
Both. They were political.
You defined
they wanted the government
last time, and I forgot
what
you said.
Anarchy is a belief that they're anti-capitalist. They believe that capitalism is the downfall of modern society, that it corrupts us, it creates greed, and that we shouldn't live. They're also anti-industrialist, anti-industrialism. They believe that people should live in small communities, and that if you're not subjected to sort of abusive capitalism, we're inherently all good people. We don't need governments at all. That's what anarchy is, really no government. Everyone just, your nature is to be a good person and to behave well. And if you're not taught to be greedy, you would do that. There are a lot of later movements that come out of anarchism, like New Harmonianism. In this country, it's closely related to the Transcendentalist movement. If you're familiar with the history of New Harmony, Indiana, which was an idealistic, socialist, utopian community, that's what anarchists wanted to build, were these socialist utopian communities. And we're going to see some images actually that suggest that in just a little bit. But even a painting like this, it's in there. When you see these, I know it's not easy to see, but these are factories in the background. And again, these great funnels putting out smoke like that, that's an anti-capitalist statement and would have been recognized as such. When you see men like this hanging around, there's another thing that, and these are sort of working class people hanging out at the beach. This is not a fun day. This is called unemployment. These are people who are there because there's no work for them. So it's political just seeing working class people. They're not supposed to have leisure. Leisure was a middle class and upper class phenomenon. Leisure is not something for the working class. So working class people aren't there because they have leisure. They have there because they're unemployed. This is why they're there. So the politics is clear. Stylistically, he's really carving out the space when we'll take a look at in a little bit, and I'll remind you of some of, well, no, I'll do it right now. I'll remind you of Monet. This is what he's reacting against. Most of the Impressionist work, they were so concerned with light, everything was about light. They weren't interested that much in space or form or carving out a three-dimensional figure or making it look like it's in a recessive space. That was simply not of interest to them. And so when you look at something like this painting by Monet, that we looked at last time, there's really not much of a sense of space in it, where Seurat is carving out these very sculptural figures and putting them into a deeply receding space. To him, that's classical. It's a kind of frozen, timeless moment with a very well constructed sense of space there. Seurat was actually one of the founders of that new independent exhibition. He was certainly very heavily involved in creating that. So he wants to bring a new life. So people didn't see this as like a separate movement. They saw this as another step in Impressionism, a correction of some of the problems of Impressionism, and certainly making it more scientific. When you look at, remember we looked at this Pissarro last time, considered an Impressionist work, largely because he's working plein air, but his politics are the same. He's still going to give us these images of capitalism as a blight on the countryside and the smoke going up into the air. So the politics are very similar. Now, we wouldn't consider Seurat an Impressionist at all. For one thing, he was never a plein air painter. And he's not trying to capture the fleeting moment. It's a very different way of working. Now, this is still early, 83, 84, so he hasn't really developed his pointillist style yet, and we'll look at something in a minute where he does. But yeah, he's a studio painter. It sometimes takes him a year to finish a painting. He's not, the Impressionists are out there, zip, 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 2 days, it's done. He's timeless and slow and calculated. It's a totally different mindset in terms of what he's creating. Plus, he's not at all interested in light. He is interested in color, but not light or natural light. I want to say something about these color theorists, because this is who Seurat and others are reading. Color theory really begins in the Western world in terms of art earlier in the century with Eugene Chevreul. Chevreul published some of his writings in 1839, and some Romantic artists were actually interested in Chevreul. Chevreul worked as he was a dye maker, a dye mixer. Color was his life, and so he's really the first person to really write about color, harmony, and contrast of color. But a lot of people didn't pay a lot of attention to him at the time. In slightly later period, other people are writing about Chevreul, and Charles Blanc in 67, now we're getting up to a more contemporary time. He wrote Grammaire des Arts du Dessin, which is the language of the art of painting. And he really talked about Chevreul. This is where he described Chevreul's ideas, particularly simultaneous contrast of color, which is very important for artists to understand. This is basically the description of how colors are affected by what colors they're next to. So in the two circles up above, the two inner squares are actually the same color. They're identical, but they don't look identical because of the colors they're placed on. Each of the background colors is pushing that color of that square in one direction or another. And what happens is the background color in this case, but the color that's next to another color will push it in the direction of the complement of the first color. So whatever, the orange one on the left, the complement is violet. So the center square is going to be pushed toward the violet. where the one on uh, the right is pushed in a different direction. These are not great examples. I have some actual physical examples that I couldn't locate, but I'm going to look for them again. If I can find them, I'll bring them in because it's easier to see. I hate looking at color theory in a reproduction because then you're dependent on the reproduced color, and it never really communicates. One on the bottom is the same thing. It's the same two blues, but they have very different properties because they're on different backgrounds. So that's simultaneous contrast, and that's going to be important to Seurat. He's not interested in light, but he is interested in color, very much so. The other thing that is important is something that Ogden Rood wrote about. Ogden Rood was an American, and Seurat knew him. He wrote Modern Chromatics in '79. This is even closer to when Seurat is working. And this is where he spells out, very importantly, the difference between additive and subtractive color mixing. Additive color mixing is generally what all people talking about color were really talking about. That's what physicists talk about. That's what Newton was talking about when he, discovers how a prism will take white light and break it into rainbow colors. He's talking about light, the color of light. And according to a physicist, when you combine all colors, they make light. They make white, right? I mean, that's called an additive mixing. But painters don't work with light. They work with pigment and paint. And therefore, it doesn't work that way. Mixing the colors on your palette is not going to mix white because you're not mixing light, you're mixing paint. In fact, it's going to get darker, not lighter when you mix. So what is being added and what is being subtracted is light. The one on the left, the more color you have, the more light you have. So you have white, which is all light. But a subtractive mixing, which is what painters have to deal with, you're losing light. Every time you mix color, you lose light. It gets less and less intense. It doesn't matter what the color is, you mix colors, it's less intense. Which means you have to think about what you're doing. And it led Seurat to a whole new way of thinking about his paint and the colors he worked with. This is actually his palette. And he only worked with minimal colors. Then this shows his obsessive nature. He absolutely was an obsessive person. He worked with 11 dabs of pure white, not one that he would mix into, but 11 separate ones so they wouldn't get corrupted by any other color. 11 dabs of pure white, and at the bottom 11 prismatic colors. These are the purest colors of the rainbow, unmixed. And then in the middle he would have a row of just that color mixed with the white above it. In other words, a tint, a row of tints. Remember, tint is any color with white mixed into it. And that's so 33 dabs, that's all, no other mixing. He would never mix. He would not take a color from down here and mix it with a color over there. He did not mix color because he wanted the most luminous or the brightest colors he could get. Therefore, you want to do the least mixing. You don't want to physically mix. And this is the theory that really leads to divisionism, or this idea of putting colors side by side rather than physically mixing them. In theory, if you put yellow, pure yellow next to a pure blue, if you do the brush marks the right size and at a certain distance, they will optically mix in your eye and you will see green, even though he didn't physically mix them to get green. And the theory is if you allow them to optically mix, you'll see a brighter, more luminous green than if you physically mixed them and took light out of the mix. So that's the technique he's experimenting with. He called it chromoluminarism. It's just a name he made up. It basically just means bright colors. I mean, literally, but that was his name for it. And his technique for doing that is the pointillist, what we call pointillism, which is simply carefully placing little points of color next to one another. Now, this, of course, is his most famous work, 7 foot by 10 foot. This is obviously not plein air. This is obviously a studio painting. very, very calculated, very studied to reach this point. We'll talk about it in detail, but I love to compare this to the Renoir painting we saw from one, an Impressionist work, because you're getting very, very different sense. They're both parks in Paris. They're both people in parks in Paris. And yet, they couldn't be more different in terms of sort of the messages that they give us, because Renoir's giving us that fleeting moment. That's that Impressionist sense of, the light is changing quickly and people are moving and talking and it's busy and a lot of activity. And Seurat is giving us this frozen, classical, timeless point of view. Now, in designing this scene, it couldn't be more artificial. In fact, the symbolists hated this painting. They called it soulless. And I can see why they would call it soulless, right? I mean, it kind of is. I always used to ask my students, when I showed this, well, which one would you rather be at? And I always amazingly got a lot of people that wanted to be at Seurat. If they wanted a nice, quiet place to sit and read and not be bothered, they wanted to go there. I get that. I mean,
it depends on my age.
it depends on, and what you want to do when you get there. I mean, there is a quietness and a calmness or a soullessness, depending on how you want to think about it. But when you look at the people, the artificiality is, first of all, nobody's interacting with anybody. I mean, there's no human interaction going on here at all. Everyone is placed at a 90-degree angle to everyone else. It's either straight profile, straight front, or straight back. I mean, the only figures that have any energy in them are the animals, right? They're allowed to move around and whatever. And yes, this is, I don't know how well you can see it, but that is a little monkey on a leash. It was just popular at the time. People would have pet monkeys and they would walk them like dogs in the park. Now, most of these people are recognizable as middle class people who were allowed to enjoy leisure, except for this guy who's clearly different. He's not dressed the same way. He's on a diagonal. He's a working class guy. He's clearly different and out of place there against something that would have been recognized at the time. Way too casual. I mean, look how everybody else is dressed. Plus, we talked about working class people wearing black and white. That's primarily the men. The women can wear some, maybe not the working class, the middle class, black and white, working class or color. So he's the only man with any sort of color here. But it's a very chiseled out space. And this wasn't done spontaneously. There's nothing spontaneous at all. He does many, many studies of the space, of every individual person as he's working through it. He intentionally was putting different classes of people together, which was part of what he did. Here's another study just working out how to put the people in place, more how to deal with the color. Now here's some details. Here are our so-called points. And this is still somewhat early. He gets more controlled a little bit later. But these small points, you can see how we're putting the oranges next to the blues, and yet when you pull back, you're starting to see you're seeing sort of purples and interesting greens, and those are coming from the optical mixing. One of the, I think, problems with this painting is that the dots he's making are small. You've got to get just the right size dot for the size of the painting and the distance of the viewer in order for that optical mixing to work. If it's too small, they're going to negate one another. If you put two complementary colors like blue and orange, together, if they're big enough, they'll intensify each other. If they're too small, they're opposites, they negate one another, and it looks gray. And I think some parts of this can look more washed out than intense. And that's just a matter of him experimenting, trying to find exactly the right technique. He really wanted to avoid anything dynamic, anything transitory. There are no, you get a feeling that there are sharp outlines around all these figures where there really aren't any outlines at all. It's just an abrupt shift between these small dots and these small dots to create this sense of outline. But here's another a good example of the detail. This is what it looks like in Chicago. It is the pride of the Chicago Art Institute. And yes, he did make his own frames. He's one of the first people to really break from the old traditional, ornate framing. And he created this wide border as a way of separating the color, outside versus the color inside, another way of controlling space and creating something more luminous. While Seurat is probably the best known to us today, he was actually not the most important of the Neo-Impressionists. Paul Signac was, and many people never heard of Paul Signac, but he's a very important artist. He was the face, the voice, and he also lived a lot longer. Seurat died, I think, in 91 or something like that, 91, early at like 31, the age of 31, very young. A lot of people said he like worked himself to death. I don't know if you can actually obsess yourself into the grave, but he did die young. But Signac goes on and has a long life and is hugely influential in the early 20th century. Also, the same politics, the same style. This is his gas holders at Clichy. It's with Signac that he's the writer, he's the voice, he's the one who's talking about what they're trying to do and explain what they're trying to do. Gas holders is a reference to these huge tanks that held the new natural gas. Natural gas had just come in to its own, and Paris just had these new streetlights that all use natural gas, and they were putting it into private homes. And so that's what this is a reference to. So this is clearly a working class family. And in fact, there are working class shirts, blue work shirts. In fact, this was controversial because of those blue work shirts. This is when color becomes very political in the hands of these people. Color is what they're all about. Color was related to the working class. The artists are all anarchists anyway, and they're talking about the working class and equality and all of this. So it all gets merged together to the point where pointillist technique had a political meaning in Paris. It meant you were sympathetic to the working class if you made little points of color. I know it's so hard today to try and explain to students why would someone making little points of color be seen as, politically aggressive? Well, it was because of who it was associated with, their known politics, and for many reasons, color in their hands becomes political. This is my favorite of the Neo-Impressionist works, and you can really see pointillism here. Signac's The Breakfast. It's a beautiful example of, and I think this is more successful in what they're trying to do than Le Grand Jatte was, because it really is the most intense colors. And it's because it isn't as large, it's a smaller painting. And so in a smaller space with these larger dots, the colors just vibrate. And yet the similarity, it's still this frozen moment, this timeless frozen moment of, carving out the space, very much like Seurat, 90-degree angles and all of that. And yet a very different way of depicting it in a smaller scale. Now, this is an interesting painting by Signac. This is their art dealer, Félix Fénion. A portrait of him, and it's really quite provocative. Now, this is 1890. This is very much influenced by the symbolist movement, which has been going on for close to 10 years now, which again, we'll get to in a week, and you'll see why. But this is imagination, right? This is purely imagination. He didn't see a wall that looked like that. And he didn't position the man in front of that wall to paint his portrait. He's making it up. He's inventing it. And so this is sort of blurring that line between the real and the idea-driven art. So it's a very important painting. It's also very symbolist in line. You know, symbolists, as we will see, use these curvilinear forms, and it's almost pre-shadowing the birth of Art Nouveau, which is like 4 years away when he paints this. But that comes out of symbolist line too, that very evocative swirling forms are symbolist in nature.
Peggy?
Yeah.
Is there any pointillism at the Nelson?
That's a really good question. They don't have a good Seurat or Signac. There's some in there because you see the influence in other artists. That's a really good question. I'm going to check up on that.
I think they have a couple that were studies for the big.
Studies. Yeah, that makes sense that would be the case. They're probably, yeah, that probably makes sense, smaller studies. And you see it in.
They only have one face in it.
Yeah, so I'll check that out and get back to you.
Thank you.
The specifics. But you still see it in the big Pissarro. You can begin to see it influencing him, and he went through a neo phase. But as far as these two artists, I'm not sure. Just the studies make sense. This is another work that is blurring that border between the symbolists and the realists. You know, women go to a well, so there could be realism there, but at the same time, that's a very popular symbolist theme because wells have always been very symbolic. It's a poetic metaphor. Also, these lines down here is this pure symbolism. I mean, I would really call this a symbolist work, but you know, he would argue it wasn't. I'm quite sure, because they hated each other. The symbolists and the neo-impressionists really hated each other, but they're doing sort of the same thing. There's really no reason for it. Beautiful painting in terms of the outlines, the intensity of the color created by these small points of color and light. And his most political work, this is, I think, one of his finest works as well. In Times of Harmony, any reference to the word harmony is political. It was recognized as a political theory related to anarchism. And as I said, in this country, New Harmonianism, New Harmony, Indiana, look it up sometime, is a town that was 2 or 3 different utopian communities. It was originally founded as the New Harmonianists when it was called New Harmony, but then they left and another utopian community came in. So it's a really interesting place I'd actually like to learn more about. So this is meant to be a utopian community. This is what life would be like in an anarchist utopian community. Everybody's working, everybody feeds everybody else. The problem with capitalism is gone. Problem with capitalism is, of course, it requires surplus. And then you get into, I don't even want to get into capitalism, but I think we're finding out right now how bad capitalism can be.
That couple looks like they're taking selfie.
Oh my God, they do. I never noticed that before. I guarantee they're not taking a selfie, but that's exactly what it looks like. Oh, that's really sad when we see it that way. But you know, even things like this reference, like reaching up off the tree, has a you know, an Eve pulling the apple, and there's a Garden of Eden sort of reference in that idea, and I think that's intentional. But you know, it's a beautiful ideal, and that's what it's about, all told in the same way. So, you know, when you see a painting like this with a clear political message painted in this style, and everybody that paints in this style has the same political belief, of course they're going to get.
Were anarchists opposed to, well, in any kind of mechanisms and stuff? I've forgotten the name for that, but
They were anti-industrialism, but they weren't like Amish. It's hard to say they believe this because there are so many different belief systems within anarchy. There are some people that were just sort of utopians like this group. There's another more aggressive political anarchist group that's operating both in England and in France at this time that are they're doing bombings. I mean, anarchists in the 90s were terrorists in Europe, other groups of them. In fact, in 93, 94, the French president was assassinated by anarchists. So they were tantamount to terrorists. And when the president was killed, they rounded up all the neo-impressionists and brought in, anybody who was that closely linked to the anarchy movement was brought in. Felix Fénéon, their dealer, was actually arrested briefly, but none of them were involved with the assassination of the president. But that's when they all toned it down or left town or started doing something else. It became politically dangerous.
Weren't there some in this country in the 20s?
Yeah, I mean, there were some later in this country, but there were some definite assassinations and bombings and executions of people involved. It gets really nasty, but this is when it was still kind of more a utopian idea rather than let's burn everything down. Now, the post-impressionists, we're going to talk about two people today. Hopefully, I'll get through both of them. And that's Paul Cézanne and Vincent van Gogh. And these are certainly two of the most important artists influencing the 20th century. They are also responding to Impressionism and what they believed was missing from Impressionism. Cézanne, I think, the most influential artist of the 19th century. That's just an opinion. Other historians will have different opinions. It depends what you're looking at in the 20th century, how you evaluate the 19th. But he comes along at a really important point in time. He comes from a conservative background. He's from the south of France, Aix-en-Provence, in Provence in the south. He was middle class, well-educated person. First came, visited Paris a few times. One of the early periods, he came up in 63 to visit, which was the year of the Salon des Refusés. So he saw the Salon des Refusés and he met a lot of people. He was a close childhood friend of Émile Zola, the writer, who's also from the same hometown. But Zola was already important in Paris. So Zola kind of took him around and introduced him to important people and kind of opened the door for him. This is an early work. Most people who know Cézanne would never recognize this as a Cézanne. It's an early work. His realist phase, 60s, the realists were the dominant. This is before Impressionism even begins. So he's most influenced by something from the 18th century here, but it's sort of Chardin. We have a beautiful Chardin actually in the Nelson Gallery, but it's just simple realism. Probably Manet is his biggest influence, even though he's not really depicting the life in the streets. He meets in the late 60s. He meets Monet, he meets the Café Gerbois circle where Manet was going and Degas was going and the Impressionists were going and Cézanne is going. He's meeting as part of that circle. But he wasn't really kind of a part of it. First of all, they didn't actually like him much at all. This is a little bit later, but 69, 70, 71, they thought he was sort of crude. He didn't dress very well. He had a sort of a crude language and was a bit coarse. He was a bit provincial for them. And the Impressionists, especially the realists, especially Manet and Degas, but even the Impressionists were sort of gentlemen, they dressed like gentlemen and you were supposed to behave. Cézanne is really the first of what I think of as the sort of bohemian artists. Those guys that are out there in left field, that do not embrace the social norms, that, he's more like that. He's not part, even though he's the same age as Monet. He's really ideologically of a later period. He's more modern than Manet. He's thinking more ahead by a long ways. And of course, like them, he's interested, they get him into landscape and the like, but he was never a plein air painter. He never worked outside. Light was not his goal. But he did like the impasto. He was really drawn to their impasto, their thick paint. And he's the first artist who really started thinking about that. He's the first person to sort of look at an impressionist painting and say, and see all this thick paint on the surface. And to him, it made him think about the picture plane, and the picture plane, remember, is this imaginary surface that you're looking through. It's the old Renaissance ideal of a painting as a window that you look through into another space, and that imaginary plane is called the picture plane. And he saw it as a picture plane, not as something that you should ignore and pretend doesn't exist while you carve out some three-dimensional illusion, but as something that's very real. And that's going to come back later. I love this painting. Cézanne is really hard to reproduce. And until I saw a lot of his works in person, I don't think I understood his color. He uses certain greens that are very hard to physically reproduce. It's better now in a digital era, but 30, 40 years ago, when you took pictures with film and had to deal with that, you could not capture that green. But digitally now you can adjust and manipulate. If you know what that green looks like, you can make the image look like that, but it's still hard to get. It's very unusual. The House of the Hanged Man. I don't know the story behind this, so don't, obviously some guy was hanged. That's all I really know about this story. But what I see here is something very, very physical. And I like this picture of it because you can really see the light is hitting this. It's a really good photograph so that the light is raking across the surface and you can see the texture very clearly. And you're very aware of the mark making and the flatness of the canvas it's painted on. And that's an important part of this for him, even as early as this. Very early on, one of the people he met and who became a really important mentor for him in the 60s especially was Pissarro. Pissarro was a mentor for Cézanne, and Cézanne always remembered that and acknowledged him. And what I like about it is, Pissarro himself, his works always had much more of that physical presence than the other Impressionists did, where Monet's and Renoir's just sort of dissolved. Pissarro's works always had this very physical sense to the objects in the picture. So there's a clear relationship here between Cézanne and Pissarro, a connection. So now we know that many landscape painters were also still life painters. So what is modernity? We've seen that term go through a number of different phases, from being about, something's modern if it's about morality and speaks about morality, or it's modern if it looks at the social environment and comments on that, or someone else says, no, it's modern if it's looking at light and telling us the truth about light and reflection. Somebody else says, no, it's modern if it's giving you luminous color and a classical timeless scene. Now, for Cézanne, that's beginning to change again. Modern is something a little bit different. Is it about truth? So, how do we remain true to the nature of the painting and the picture plane? Okay, let's say you decided that truth is important to you. And we know they've been talking about truth since mid-century. It's just that people have had different ideas about what that meant. What kind of truth are you talking about? But truth has been important. So how are you being true when you make a painting about something that's three-dimensional? Let's think about that. This has been, it's always been this way, right? What painters have always done is try and convince us that this flat thing isn't really flat, right? Because what painters have done is try to take a three-dimensional thing and translate it into a two-dimensional world. And to do that, they've lied to us. They've basically said, okay, this is a window and you're looking through this glass and you're looking in this three-dimensional space, and I'm going to be really good at creating this illusion. I mean, since the Renaissance, this has been true. In fact, they were the best at it. Well, Cezanne is saying, well, if you're going to be true, that's not true. That's not honest. This is a flat surface. So how can I be true to what I depict and how I depict it at the same time? How do I find a language, a visual language, to communicate a three-dimensional world in a two-dimensional space, a two-dimensional reality? We call that pictorial reality, and I'll use that term more and more. So the idea of pictorial is sort of the flatness of a thing. So if the ultimate of being modern is truth, I have to find a way, I have to find a new language. I have to find a completely new visual language. Because linear perspective and chiaroscuro modeling and all those things that have been used as techniques to create that illusion of three dimensions, those things are lies. I have to find a new way. And so the rest of his work is experimenting. It's trying to find that language. Now, he's in a somewhat awkward position because he's still a 19th century artist and he's still tied to the physical external world. The 20th century artist isn't going to feel tied to the three-dimensional world. They're going to feel freer to work in a non-objective and abstract way because they don't feel they have to paint a bowl of apples. They can just paint circles and squares and non-objective forms. And that's a lot easier to speak in a two-dimensional language when you're not trying to reproduce the look of a three-dimensional world. But he still is, because he's 19th century artist. It hasn't occurred to him to not do that, although it will occur to some artists, some symbolist artists, to do that. So he's doing things here like he's not modeling with chiaroscuro. Remember, chiaroscuro just means shadows, right? Shadows, dark. He's modeling with color. You know, where this is just, instead of a shadow, it's just a different color. So modeling with color, tilting up the picture plane. This idea of multiple points of view is in the air. And this is early, man, 77 is very early for someone to giving multiple points of view. And he's not doing it a lot here. You know, where before have we seen floors tilted up? So you're seeing weird angles. Anybody remember where that influence was coming
I
from?
remember, but no.
We saw it in Degas. It was coming from Japanese prints. The Japanese print,
Oh, yeah.
everything is flat. There's no modeling. You're seeing things at odd angles. This isn't some wild idea he's making up. It's been around. They've been seeing it for 30 years in Japanese prints. They're embracing it now more than ever. So absolutely, Japanese prints are having an effect, and they've been doing it since the 18th century, not just the 19th. It was a much more advanced way of thinking, and now these artists come along and it becomes important to them, and it's like, whoa, those guys are doing it. They've been doing it a long time. They know how to do it. Let's look at how they did it. See if we can figure that out. So we're getting pattern on pattern as well. I love this comparison because to me, this is a perfect Cezanne versus Monet sensibility, the difference. And Cezanne's is actually earlier than the Monet. When I look at these now, Monet in 1880 looks very backward. It looks very old fashioned because Cezanne is already moving into a new direction. You know, Monet is still tied to a Renaissance perspective. Absolutely, he is. He's showing you that table in a receding space. You know, he's modeling forms. We have traditional shadows. It's really quite different. And Cezanne's new conception of the two-dimensional surface is clear. You know, when Monet is looking through a window still, he's giving us that sense of 3D space. Cezanne is not. He's not concerned with it and not interested in it. This is I love the Bay of Lestat. He works in series, you know, of his works. There are certain series where there are many, many different works on the same subject. Being modern is now less about the experience of time and more about form and pictorial reality. Now, what is two-dimensional reality? Now, I don't know if I've mentioned it before. I'll mention it now because I just got my book out and started rereading it. Has anybody ever read Flatland, the book written in the 1890s? I can't remember I never can remember his first name. Last name is Abbott. It's still in print, little tiny book. Highly recommend reading this book. It's about this, it's a fantasy book, but it's about this being who is two-dimensional, and he's really from a two-dimensional world, but he has somehow managed to lift himself off the surface, and he's discovered a three-dimensional world. And it's about him describing what life is like in a two-dimensional reality. It's incredible. Every artist should read, you know, try it. What would it be like if you were two-dimensional? What would you actually see? How would you tell one person from another? How could you have a house and doors and rooms? And how do different shapes relate to one another? It's incredible. At the same time, it's totally Victorian. It's unbelievably sexist and racist and every other horrible thing you can think of. But if you can read past that and understand, you know, when this was written and just realize they were a bunch of sexist pigs, then, and just look at the description of two-dimensional. That's what I'm talking about. There is in this book, there is a reality, a two-dimensional reality. We know that. Well, we can't know because we're locked. We're stuck in a three-dimensional world. We can't conceive of a two-dimensional reality, and we can't conceive of a four-dimensional reality. Our brains won't do that. Won't allow us to do that. And in our reality, there is no such things as two dimensions. It doesn't exist. It's a mental construct. It's an idea. It's nothing but an idea, because in our world, everything's three-dimensional. We can't actually have anything truly two-dimensional in our world. It's not possible. No matter how flat it is, there's still going to be, you know, an atom, a quark, or some little particle that's three-dimensional that makes up that thing. So it's just an idea in our world. But that book, Flatland, really describes what it would be like to have a reality, a pictorial reality. And that's really what Cezanne is thinking about. So it's about form, shape, and that reality. Now, this is one of, I think, his best examples of what he's trying to understand, and that is that relationship between 2D and 3D. Now, on the one hand, our mind tells us, we know what we're looking at, right? You recognize the landscape, that it's a bay of water. We know that this body of land up here must be farther away than this body of water. So intellectually, we can read space, but at the same time, he's doing all sorts of things you're not supposed to do that contradict that. Because if you really wanted this to look far away, it wouldn't be these colors. The brush marks would be much smaller. The colors would be grayer, especially the body of water. By making this more intense right here, he's flattening that. It's like the flat areas just pop up, and it's a conflict. There's a lot of tension in this painting. It's a conflict between 2D and 3D. On the one hand, you see 3D. On the other hand, it snaps back up and you see it as 2D. And finding that balance is really not an easy thing to do, finding that balance between 2D and 3D. as the forms sort of blur into one another, these sort of vertical, these marks are identical to these marks, which are identical to these marks. And you shouldn't do that if you want to create the illusion that that's farther away. They should be smaller, not the same size. It's an optical illusion, in a sense, the way he's sort of giving us this conflicting information. That's why it's troubling, because he's giving us conflicting information. He's speaking in two languages at the same time, a two-dimensional language and a three-dimensional language. And he's doing that on purpose to create this conflict, to make you think about it, to think about the picture plane, the flatness of it. And it works. It is flat. The other thing he's trying to do that was something that he saw as missing from Impressionism is structure. In the same way that Seurat felt the Impressionists weren't giving us structure and form, so does Cezanne. And there's a bit in his work that wants to bring that structure back, particularly search for elemental structure. He's looking for these little elemental forms, if you reduce everything in nature. He wrote to a friend once, a young artist, and he said, you need to learn to see nature in the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone. In other words, if you could just see these basic geometric shapes, everything in nature is made up of these elemental shapes and forms. And so you can see that that's what he's addressing in something like this. This is also very influenced by Corot. And I remind you of that early Corot we looked at, which is also, there's a classical element to this idea of structure, that classicists did this. They would repeat these primary sort of geometric shapes and forms. So we're seeing this line again from Corot through Pissarro, through Cezanne. And this is a lineage that runs through the whole 19th century that takes us from beginning of the century to the middle and to the end and right into the 19th. So there are many different lines of development, but this is one line that I find very interesting. When we look at a Cezanne like this, and I think this is a beautiful comparison, the way they both have a kind of classical clarity and purity to them. Though Cezanne is flattening it out. I mean, you can see the difference. Corot is giving us a more traditional, recession of space, and we're supposed to pretend like it's a window, etc., where Cezanne is flattening everything out. But when you look at one of his Saint Victoire, and we have one of his in the Nelson, they're all wonderful. This is a series he did a lot late in the 80s and early 90s. It's a location near his hometown in the south of France. So he painted this mountain a lot. And it's a wonderful way to examine space, but it's also very classically designed. Classical landscapes, traditionally going back to the 17th century, have something tall in the background to stop your view. They're typically framed. This one isn't just framed, but they're sort of diagonal roads or things that lead your eye back. It's a very short step between passages in a painting like this and the Cubists. This Cubism comes right out of Cezanne. Cezanne dies in 1906. 1907, Picasso is exhibiting works based on him. There's a huge retrospective of Cezanne's paintings in 1906, right at the moment when the young artists in Paris were ready to learn about this two-dimensional language. So it's completely continuous. And some of his works, you could isolate a passage and put it next to a Cubist painting and you couldn't tell the difference. We'll deal with that in the spring. But here's the classical side of him. Framed by the trees, which follow the shape of the mountain. I mean, how logical is that going to actually happen? The mountain that stops your view, the diagonals that lead your eye back, just based on good, true French classicism, while at the same time he's experimenting with, form and giving the sky a kind of physical quality as well. So all of these particular paintings that, what we're seeing is a man who can't help but have a French eye. He's French. And it has shaped how he sees things in the world classically, but also with beautiful paint and beautiful color. This one is like really directly influenced by the greatest French classicist of all time, Nicolas Poussin, going back to 17th century, the founder. When the French Academy was formed in 1648, it was formed on the style of Nicolas Poussin. It was based on that. That is the essence of what French artists are supposed to do. And Cézanne is still studying Poussin. So, he's still linked to that French tradition in the way, you have the mountain in the background, the trees framing it, the repetitions of shapes, the way this clouds is repeating this shape, the repetition of these shapes, the diagonal road that leads your eye back. This is a pure French classical painting. With a modern, in a slightly more modern language, but very, very traditional. Now, what I've always loved about Cézanne is the fact that there's sort of two sides of him. He's a complicated person. On the one hand, he has this analytical mind where he's analyzing the picture plane and the classical shapes and the repetitions of elemental forms, all that. It's very analytic. But he also had a very romantic side to him that would pop up once in a while. And as he got older, that romantic side began to dominate his work more. And that's why I personally just love his late works, the infamous Quarry series, so-called old age style, which I mentioned before. And I think as he got older, he became less analytical. And we get paintings like this. He also did a lot of watercolors in his late years too. And the colors that he uses are just sort of luscious. What's romantic about these are the colors more than anything else. And it's sort of dissolving in this beautiful brushwork. It's much more romantic than classical. It's not about orderliness or elemental forms. It just sort of dissolves in this beautiful mark making, very, very two-dimensional. And then this, one of the last, Chateau Noir, and he does a series on the Chateau Noir. This is very romantic. You're seeing this sort of villa like mysteriously through the trees, and again, these warm colors and the sort of evocative. This is the symbolist influence. I call it romantic, but it's really also symbolist influence, particularly these sort of gnarly branches that come down. So this is late Cézanne, truly lovely work. So Cézanne, now, he lives longer than any of the neo or post-impressionists. Well, that's not true. Signac outlives him. Hell, Monet outlives him. Monet lives until 1926. Monet has a long life. But Seurat is dead in 91, Van Gogh, as we'll see, in 90, Gauguin in 03, but then lastly 06, Cézanne. And everybody gets a big retrospective when they die. That's like a rule in the art world. You die, you get your work shown. It's just rough to have to wait that long for it to happen, but he dies in 06 and gets a big exhibition. So that's when his influence is felt. And you can track that back. They also started getting more headway, 3 or 4 or 5 little galleries and art dealers and were showing their work. So that's how people are getting to know. But because they're all dead, by '06, this is when Signac's influence gets greater, the neo-impressionists. He's still alive until 1935. So his impact is huge. He's the great old master. They've forgotten about Monet. Monet left. He may be alive, but he's out in his garden somewhere. He's not in Paris. He's not paying any attention. So they're not thinking about him. The guy in Paris in the 20s, at the beginning of the century, having all the influence, that is Paul Signac, and that is neo-impressionism. And it's why everybody in the early 20th century goes through a neo-impressionist phase. In fact, Signac was so successful by then, he had a villa on the Riviera, and he would invite young artists down like for the summer. And young Matisse spent a summer early in the century down at his villa. And he comes back and we'll see, Matisse has this neo-impressionist, phase like everybody else. Yes.
Am I imagining, or that orange, yellow, bright orange yellow, he's using that in a lot of his paintings?
Yeah.
That's his favorite color.
Yeah, that reminds me of like Renoir coral kind of color, only it's prettier. It's a little prettier. Yeah, I find it a very romantic color. Yeah, I think it is. And the way he's using it with the green, they set off. Yeah,
I see that in several of the pieces.
the later work, and it definitely is a color that comes up a lot in his work. And it peeks through. Yeah. But little bits of it here and there. I think it's a moody color.
Contrasts the green.
Yeah, it contrasts a beautiful moody sort of color. Okay, so let's talk about our second post-impressionist. Everybody knows about Van Gogh, right? What can we say about Van Gogh? Well, let's clarify some things. There's so many stories about him. True ones, not true ones. First of all, he was not an insane person, and his art does not come from an insane mind. However, he did have problems, and he had all of his life, he had serious physical problems, which were exacerbated later in his life by many years of malnutrition and not taking care of himself. So he had serious emotional problems and psychological problems. He had all of those things, and they all feed into this sort of romantic idea of Van Gogh. And those over romantic ideas bother me a lot. When the song came out, what is it, in the 70s, like Starry Night,
I
right?
listened to that this morning.
Yeah, wonderful timing.
Well, I listened to it on purpose. 'cause
Oh,
I knew
that's
we were gonna be
great.
talking about
Right,
this.
now doesn't
It's still a beautiful song.
it is I love, what can I say? Of course it's a beautiful song, but doesn't it sort of suggest that like people just
talks
didn't
about-
understand
It
him,
talks
right?
about dealing with his sanity and stuff.
Right,
like that.
right. And like they just didn't understand you. And I've seen so many people talk about like, we get you now, we would welcome you. It's like,
Wasn't syphilis a lot of the problem?
no, it was, but not with him.
Oh,
He
was it?
didn't.
Oh.
No, that's Gauguin. That's the next guy.
Oh,
And no, he didn't have syphilis, but he had lots of other things. But the truth is, if Van Gogh were around today, he would be just as weird a person as he was then. I mean, it's not like they didn't get him. He was really strange. And if you've ever met people who just didn't socialize well and couldn't really talk to other people and hold a conversation, or you just couldn't interact with them, that's him. Now, as far as what people have loved over the years to speculate what was wrong with him, we have a better idea now than before. Several things were wrong with him. I think it's very likely he was on the spectrum to some extent, that this would be part of his inability to really interact with people well. He was most likely also bipolar, because he would have incredible highs and crashing lows. And they now think that he had some kind of epileptic condition. So he would have these seizures where he wouldn't be able to really work or do anything for long periods of time. Now, those are just sort of physical things. Emotionally, people talk about, I mean, I don't know how much this is really affect him, but he had an older brother who died. He wasn't really meant to be Vincent van Gogh. He had an older brother who was born and named Vincent van Gogh. His brother died, and then he was born, and then he was named Vincent. So all of his life, he would go to the cemetery and see this tombstone for Vincent van Gogh. So, I mean, that's got to be weird to like just go and like you're looking at your own tombstone or something. But I don't know how much that really would mess somebody up. I think that's reading into that a bit much. I think it's mostly those conditions that I just talked about that were his problem, but that led him to art fairly early on for good reasons. He did have a tragic life, and thankfully for his brother Theo, who got him through the years that he managed to function. They were very, very close, and most of what we know about him comes from letters between Vincent and Theo that Theo and his wife kept. Now, he attempted many careers in his life, and he was just a failure at all of them. The family had two traditional careers that sort of ran in the family. One was preacher. He's Dutch. Most important thing to remember about Van Gogh, as opposed to all the other neo and post-impressionists, is that he's Dutch. He's not French. All these other guys are French. And that makes a difference because, for one thing, Van Gogh is our expressionist. He brings us expressive art, and that's not going to come from a French artist. That's not French tradition. French artists are not expressive. They're not overly emotional. It's a subdued, more classical sentimentality in French art and French culture. It's a reserved quality, but he's Dutch. He's not French. So he's giving us this more expressive art. So therefore, he's a Protestant, and being a preacher runs in the family. His father, his grandfather, it's sort of tradition to be a preacher. The other traditional job in the family is in the arts. He had a couple of uncles who were art dealers. His brother was an art dealer. So he tried both of those. He tried working in an art gallery in London with one of his uncles for a while. Total failure at that. Tried being a preacher. He never could handle formal schooling. So, that didn't work. So he tried being what they called a popular preacher, which is like not someone who's really ordained, but someone who just comes and speaks to people. Couldn't handle that, so he tried being a vagabond preacher, and that's somebody who just is on the road. And he did that for a while, traveling through the mining towns and communities in Belgium primarily. That didn't go very well either. Interestingly, I've often said this, and it seems kind of weird, but being an art dealer and being a preacher actually requires some of the same skills. They're very similar in that you have to be a very similar kind of person. You have to have really good communication skills, and people have to trust you. You have to be the kind of person that people like and want to listen to. And that's exactly who he wasn't. I mean, in any way. People were afraid of him. They thought he was weird. They couldn't understand him. He was a religious person. He felt strongly about primarily nature and God and nature. He felt for the poor. He intentionally wore old, dirty, ragged clothes when he was a vagabond preacher. They just thought that was weird. Why would you dress like a hobo? So none of that worked. But while he was on the road, that's when he started drawing. That's when he just started, sketching and drawing. And it became more and more important to him because it became his voice. It became the way he could communicate how he felt that way. And that's really where it all starts and why it was so important to him. I mean, you can see why he becomes this romanticized figure, this bohemian artist who suffers for their art. This is, he, Cézanne, Gauguin, this generation are the ones around whom this myth of the artist is constructed, is created. And it's reasonable because they kind of lived that. They were the outsiders who struggled for their art, unlike a lot of the earlier artists. This is one of those early drawings, the bearers of the burden. It's a sort of thing that he was drawn to. His work is all based on what he saw. People don't always understand, but one of the things I always say about Van Gogh is he is the ultimate realist. And if you think of realism as like a style, meaning accuracy, then you would wonder what I was talking about, because he exaggerates colors and forms and shapes. But what I mean is, he said, and he absolutely meant, he could not draw or paint something unless he was standing in front of it. I mean, he literally had to see it and be there. And that is the essence of a realist. His tied to the reality that he lived in was stronger than anybody, any realist, even stronger than Courbet. So, we see works like this. He tried some formal schooling in art. He tried to study color. He got a lot done, but, he doesn't really get much out of it. I think most of his work is just intuitive, which is just fine. Here's an early work. His earlier work, is very little color. This is before he sort of took on the idea of studying color. One of his most famous early pieces, The Potato Eaters. In this one, he wanted to show, and again, he writes letters to his brother about pretty much everything he does. We know more about Van Gogh than any other artist who's ever lived, simply because he's written letters about everything. We know exactly what he thought. We know exactly why he did what. We know when. He dated everything by month. So we know, what month, where he was, what he was thinking, what he was doing. And that makes us feel closer to an artist. As well. So it's another reason, I think, why people feel a connection with him. He wanted us to see these as people of the earth. They are earthy. It's like he's molded them out of the earth. I can't help but think he's like made them look like potatoes. Right? The potato eaters. I mean, they kind of look like potatoes. I mean, it's very early and he has little or no sense of color, but he said he wanted them to be like people who have dug the earth. They speak of manual labor. They have honestly earned their food. I mean, these are ideas that are important to him. He did go to Amsterdam and tried to study color. And he starts slowly bringing it in. Another reason why we feel connected to any artist when we see them. I mean, when they do a lot of self-portraits. I mean, he's known for that. In fact, the last artist historically who was known for doing a lot of self-portraits is another artist we feel close to, and a Dutch compatriot, and that's Rembrandt. I mean, Rembrandt was the last artist who did large numbers of self-portraits, and we feel very connected to him. And now another Dutch artist comes along several hundred years later, and we feel a similar connection. So self-portraits are not egotistical. Self-portraits are a way, is done by, well, that's not true. I can think of a couple artists who did a lot of self-portraits because they were egotistical. But in both Rembrandt and Van Gogh, it's more a way of trying to understand themselves, trying to examine, really look into yourself. So this is an early one, not much color. I love his shoes. He does a number of these shoes. he's influenced by the symbolists here. He might not acknowledge it, but this is symbolic. He's analyzing the people by looking at their shoes. This is what the symbolists would have done. But yeah, it's like the potato eaters. It's sort of rough, and they're people of the earth. And I love his shoes. But he still doesn't quite know how. He's totally self-taught, so he doesn't know mark making. He does a lot of contour lines. In fact, his paintings, as we'll see in a minute, he basically draws with paint because that's what he learned to do. He just taught himself to draw, and now he just uses paint instead of graphite and basically works with line, and that becomes his style, except for the period where he comes under the influence of the neo-impressionists like everybody else. He's in Paris at this time. And like everybody else, can we shut this door so we can hear a little better? Because that's hard to. Hi, Judith.
Hi, everybody. How are you?
We're good.
Good to see all of you.
Wow, so many people back at the church. So starting to feel normal again. Okay, interior of a restaurant. He's in Paris. He's visiting his, staying with his brother in '86. He's meeting people. The way people got to meet people in Paris is there were a few art dealer shops, and there were some art supply shops. There was one really famous one, Père Tanguy. In fact, he did a portrait of Père Tanguy, Brother Tanguy, who ran a art supply store, and it was a gathering place. It was also a little gallery. Artists who didn't have money to buy supplies would trade paintings for supplies. I'll give you this painting, for some more paint. And so this art supply store had paintings all around of some of the most incredible, contemporary artists doing stuff they couldn't yet sell. And artists would hang out there. And that's where he met, I think his brother introduced him to Gauguin. Artists would meet other artists in places like this. So, and also our dealers who would have their own exhibitions, and artists would go with other artists. And it's just this little society, it's a small place. Paris really wasn't that big, and it was a small art community, and everybody knows everybody else. And he tried functioning in Paris for a long time, but this is clearly his attempt at pointillism, right? He was a kind of sponge, and he had little ego. He had no strong ego. So whatever people would tell him to do, he would just do. Even if he didn't really want to. And that's going to be a bit of a problem. Clearly, a strong personality could bulldoze right over him. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Here's his self-portrait from that period. Also clearly neo-impressionist or pointillist inspired. We're getting these intense colors. I think this is what brought him into color. He doesn't continue with the small points. He goes back to his own mark making, but it introduced a kind of intensity of color to him that he liked. And he will continue with at this time. In fact, it's an interesting comparison. Both of these were painted at the same time. 86, 87, you've got Signac doing his most important work, and Van Gogh being sort of influenced by this more powerful personality and this new style and intensity of style. The other thing he's very influenced by is Japanese prints. Now, he was, dead poor. He usually had to choose. Well, he's in Paris at this time, so he's with his brother, so he's not starving or anything, and he's got a little bit of money. But usually later, he's having to decide between, do I buy paint or do I eat today? It's usually the question. But Japanese prints were so cheap that, even someone as poor as Van Gogh could afford to buy prints. And he was very influenced. In fact, he's literally copying a Japanese print. He's doing it in his own style, though. He's not, doing it in the very flat, color techniques of Japanese prints, he's doing it with more gusto and his own technique. People always want to know, is this real Japanese writing? And I have the foggiest idea. I don't know whether he found some writing somewhere. Clearly, there's not this much on this print, so I don't know whether he tried to duplicate it or not. And then he does what many artists did who are influenced by Japanese prints, is that instead of like duplicating what they were doing, trying to absorb the sensibility of a Japanese print in a Western style painting. And this is one where he's clearly experimenting with that idea. He's painting a woman, but he's trying to reference the style of Japanese print. Another one he's copied. This is one that influences Gauguin as well, as we'll see next week, this particular Hiroshige print with the tree. Now, February of '88 is a very important time for him. All things change in February of '88. He decides to go down to the south of France, to his little village called Arles, and he has to get out of Paris. He can't function in Paris. The city is just too much, too loud, too many people, and he's not getting along with people, and he just wants to get away so he can work. So he goes down to Arles, and his brother sort of supports him during this period, although he can't afford much. This is really one of the last good years of his life. He has a short career, 10 years max, and the majority of his paintings were all made within a 3-year period, and within that, mostly in 1 year. So if you're ever asked the date of a Van Gogh painting, guess 1888, and you got a really good chance of being right. Probably a 70% chance that you're right, or within a year. So 88 and 89. So he goes down to the south. This is the first thing he does. I mean, literally February, he gets there and he does this self-portrait. He's clearly optimistic. Whenever artists who are from the north, meaning Paris, or in his case, even the Netherlands, whenever they go down to the Mediterranean, everything changes. They're exposed to a new kind of light that they've never seen before. And every artist goes through this. Their color gets brighter and lighter. It's that something about that Mediterranean light. Many Parisian artists go down to the Riviera or somewhere in the south, and their art changes. And he just loved the light down there. And clearly this is a moment where he's happy and optimistic. He from fairly early on, he began dreaming of a kind of artist community in Arles. This idea had been around for a while. There were a couple of places in Germany that were artist communities where artists had gone off to live in a village. I mean, you could argue that the Barbizon painters, when they went down to the little village of Barbizon to live and work, they formed like a little artist colony or community. As we'll talk more about last time, '88 is the same time that Gauguin is going off to the west coast of France to form a little artist colony in Pontavon in the west. We'll talk about that. And Van Gogh knows about all these. So he has this dream of there being a little artist colony down in the south as well. So he's writing home during this time about these ideas. And he's writing to other artists. He's writing to his brother. He's communicating with Gauguin, who he had met in Paris. Gauguin didn't like him, but then most people didn't like him, but he wanted Gauguin to come down to the south of France, and he wanted him to bring some of his students, young artists who were sort of centering around Gauguin in the West. He wanted them to come down, and Gauguin just wasn't really interested in doing that. So it's a really positive and period for him, but also a very scary period. He was worried about money, worried about his expenses, and he's writing to his brother about how he's trying to find what's essential. He's talking about his savage brush strokes, etc. You can see how he's using line here. He uses contour lines that follow the shape of the surface of forms. It's very much his style. This is done not too long after he got there. I'm not sure what month, but somewhere in the summer of '88. And it's very him, the style he's developing. He would just go out every day to the country roads and the farms and paint. He loved the color yellow. It's sort of the dominant color in his work. What he believed was missing from Impressionism was emotion. I mean, Impressionist art, I mean, when you look at Monet in particular, it's quite emotionless. It's a very dispassionate look at light. I mean, not until you get into his work of the 90s, but his work of the 70s is really quite cold and dispassionate. And that's what Gauguin couldn't, pardon me, what Van Gogh couldn't deal with. He's an emotional person. All of his emotion is put into his art, and that's what he wants to bring to it. But we still see him working plein air. We still see him using, dealing with light is important to him in similar ways. And this is an important early work. Now this, which I think is a really beautiful little painting called The Sower, is him as a fan of realism more than a realist. This is not something he saw. It's a remake of another painting that we've actually seen, and I'll remind you of in a minute. But before we leave this one, I just want to say something about those colors. These are his favorite colors in the whole world, yellow and violet. They're complementary colors, so they vibrate off one another. It's that shadow, that's the color the Impressionists saw in shadow outdoors. It's that wonderful rich impasto that we see here in the details of all of these, how he's following the shapes of the forms. It's really luscious, but it's based on Millet. Remember Millet, the realist who worked with Courbet, who did images of the peasants in the countryside. He did the Angelus and the Gleaners. This is his version of The Sower. Van Gogh owned a print of it, just a black and white print of this image, and did a couple of different versions of Millet's The Sower. This one totally merges with the Japanese prints. I mean, these are the colors, the forms of Japanese prints. He even gives us this tree crossing the form, like that Hiroshige print we saw a moment ago, where the tree jutted across the surface of things that look like sort of orange blossoms, the colors. It's a merging of several things. It's a combination of looking at Millet, at looking at Japanese prints, at looking at the world around him, all merging together to create his style. His most famous work of the fall of '88 is the Night Cafe, which is very well known painting. Not large, none of his work is large, it's all small. And he wrote to his brother about this one as well. It interested him for a long time. It's a cafe in Arles that was open all night. And he talked about at night, you go in there at 2 a.m. or whatever. And he said it would be full of vagabonds and outcasts who take shelter there, like himself, as he was one of those people there at 3 a.m. He said it was a place where you could express the terrible passions of humanity, a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime. The powers of darkness is how he described it. But you just sense that this is like 2 or 3 a.m, right? The intensity of those lights and colors, the way he's using the yellows and the greens playing off. This is a good example of simultaneous contrast of color, because the red and the green are complements. So because of the red, it's going to push green down onto the yellow. So it's almost a sick kind of yellowy green, but it's disturbing. And he's exaggerating this perspective and tilting up the floor like a Japanese print again, in order to exaggerate and intensify the scene. This is at the museum at Yale University. It's really a beautiful piece. Okay, so what happens? Self-portrait dedicated to Paul Gauguin. He so desperately wanted Gauguin to come down. I have to talk about this relationship because we're going to talk about Gauguin next time. So I'll give you a bit of a preview of the man. First of all, he was older than most of the other artists. He got started later in life, Gauguin did. He was also immensely self-confident, and he had all these younger artists sort of following around, listening to every word he said. He had a huge ego. So of course, Van Gogh admired him the way everybody else did. That's why he wanted him to come down. And he painted this self-portrait dedicated to Paul Gauguin and sent it to him in hopes of trying to get him to come down to work with him because he so admired the man. And he paints himself almost like a monk. I mean, he wants to look like an ascetic, right? Like a monk, like he's showing his head's almost shaved and he's thin because he wants to communicate that this is almost like this is an isolated community down here. Come down here. There's no world encroaching on us, almost like, you know, you're in a monastery. I mean, Gauguin didn't want to live like a monk, but Van Gogh did anyway. So that's what this, I love this painting. That green just vibrates, it just glows. It's really, I think his most beautiful of the self-portraits. So what happens and where does it all go wrong? Because we all know what happened here, right? This is the ear issue. So in October of '88, Vincent is so desperate. He writes to his brother, we should become. So Theo, knowing Gauguin and knowing that Gauguin was always in economic trouble, writes to Gauguin and says, listen, my brother really wants you to come down to Arles. Let's make a deal. I'll pay off these bills for you if you will go down and spend a couple of months in Arles with my brother. So Gauguin was in trouble and he needed the money. So he said, all right. So he goes down in October of 1888. And what he finds just blows his mind. Van Gogh is living in this dump. It's a mess. His paints are a mess. His studio's a mess. I mean, he was a mess. He wasn't eating anything. He was basically just drinking coffee and absinthe, which is a bad idea in the best of times. And so Gauguin was like a totally opposite person. So first thing he does is he cleans everything up, he organizes everything, he gets him on a schedule, he gets food in so he can cook meals. And so at first, it was great because he was getting good meals, he was living in a clean environment for the first time. And then it starts going wrong because then Gauguin starts his usual pontification about how you should work. And preview for next week, Gauguin is connected to the symbolists. He starts out as a realist, but he more and more embraces philosophies, and he's a highly educated person. He increasingly embraces philosophies that reject realism and embrace more the imagination. And so he starts preaching to Van Gogh, stop looking at the world, stop painting what you see, start using your mind and work from your imagination, and all these things that were the total antithesis to who Van Gogh was. I mean, he couldn't do this, but he didn't say anything. He kept trying and doing it and holding it in. This is the problem, was part of his communication skills, because you or I would have just said, listen, Paul, this works for you. That's great that you do this, but that's not me. You know, I need things in front of me. I work this way. And then everything would have been fine. But he wasn't capable of doing that. So he held it in and he held it in and he held it in until apparently a couple of days before Christmas, he started throwing dishes at Gauguin. He just went nuts. He went crazy, lost it. And then went after him with a straight razor. He was going to kill him. I mean, it was just like he held it in and then like exploded. I could understand his frustration because Gauguin would have been horribly infuriating, but he was incapable of really dealing with that kind of person. So he chased, basically Gauguin left, he packed a bag and was gone. That was it. And here's Van Gogh running around the village with a straight razor. And that's when he cut off part of his ear and gave it to this prostitute who lived in the village. That has more to do with the idea. I think he was infatuated with her, but that has to do with like the bullfighter who gives the bull's ear to his love or whatever, as bizarre as that is. It's part of bullfighting. But all of that is secondary to his general self-destructive behavior. This was just one more act in a life of self-destructive behavior. He was starving himself. It was just downhill. And he'd been having, the blackouts started again. He would have these blackouts, these periods where he couldn't work. And then when he felt better, then he would start painting again. But so his paintings don't come out of dark times. He could only paint when he was feeling good. But they kept coming, he'd think, oh, this is over. It's been a month now. I'm past this. And then he would have another one of these sort of blackouts and deep depressions. And it just played on him. The people in the village saw him running around, and ears bleed profusely. If you've never nicked an earlobe or something, he's covered in blood. And they immediately got a petition out and put him to be committed to a state hospital. Well, his brother came down, got him out of the state hospital, and got him a place. Here's a second one with the Japanese print in the background, which is interesting. It's his left ear, and you know that because he painted this looking in a mirror, right? So it looks like it's his right ear, but it was his left ear because he's looking in a mirror. So his brother gets him into a private hospital in another village, a village of Saint-Rémy, and he was there for almost a year. And it was actually a really good time for him, because this wasn't the state hospital. The state hospitals were horrible. You didn't want to, go anywhere near those. It's like Bedlam in London or something. But this is a private hospital, and he had two rooms, actually, a room to sleep in, a room he could use as a studio. He wasn't locked in anywhere. He could go outside and the like. And this is where he got 3 meals a day. I mean, he'd never eaten so well in his life. He'd never been so well taken care of. This is one of his most famous works from this late period, Starry Night, from his window at his hospital, which was clearly up on the hill. And it's him returning to his realist roots. And, lest it look like it's imaginary, that this is an expressive interpretation of what he saw. It's emotional, it's personal, it's passionate. And there's always probably someone working on a dissertation, because those are the people that are most insane about following up on everything. Somebody went to this hilltop in the month when he would have painted this and identified this as the Milky Way, that in fact he's just being a realist again. He saw this big white swirl. Of course, he's exaggerating it. It's an expressive interpretation of what he saw, but even the stars are in the right places. So he's still looking at it, even though he takes it into a really personal interpretation of what he sees. It's been pointed out many times, the way he's linking this tree, this flame-like sort of, I don't know what kind of tree it is, but he's almost linking it to the steeple of the church intentionally, as a connection between still his own sort of religious beliefs, in which he connects nature and God and all of the rest. He's doing well for a while, and then it starts again. And then he fell into an even deeper depression, because, he thought this was the solution. Finally, it's going to get better. And then when it isn't, he went into a depression he never came out of. I think he left there in 90. His brother got him a place. Here's a detail where you can see the impasto and the sort of emotional mark making. Got him a room with a doctor who had a room to rent, Dr. Gachet, in Auvers, which is another little village not too far from in Paris. And he lived a few months with Dr. Geshe, well, a couple of months, and that's about 3 months. I think it was in May of 90. This seemed like a good, he's out of the hospital. He's living with someone who is a doctor who could sort of take care of him a little bit or watch out for him. This portrait of Dr. Geshe is the painting that just is the highest selling. I hate mentioning these things. I don't like talking about sales prices, but of Van Gogh's work, this is the painting that just in 1990 was up for auction and was sold for 82.5 million, which is not by even close to the highest price ever paid for a painting. That was a Leonardo, very simple Leonardo painting that sold for 450 million. But then it drops down to like 200 million from that. That was like 200 million over what anyone had ever.
Do we know who bought that or where it went?
It was we know it was private.
Private.
Yeah, we don't, it wasn't a museum or anything. It was a private purchase at auction. But yeah, in his life, he sold one. We hear about these numbers, even living artists, paintings going at auction for, in the millions. But understand, the artist never sees a penny of that. This is a secondary market, always the secondary market. It's whoever bought it the first time is now reselling it. They're the ones that make the money. So artists never get anything for what their art sells for, even living artists. So then in July, let's see, I've got another painting. This is in June. He was going out in the countryside and painting, and he shot himself. Now, it has always been said, or had always been said, that this was his last painting, that this was the painting he was working on when he shot himself. But there's a new Van Gogh Trust in Amsterdam believes they have a later painting, and I'll show you that in a minute. But before, just looking at this is a disturbing image. I think it's easy to see that this is like those dark sky. This is not his beautiful yellow sun. This is a person who's sort of settled into a sort of lower level of expectations. The dark crows, I mean, this is a darker scene for him. But we think we now know of a painting from July, and this would be the only painting from July of 1890. And it's really fascinating. It's called Tree Roots, and it's entirely different from what he's done before. It's a close-in view of something, as opposed to, a big wide view, which is what he normally does. This is sort of narrowing in. I mean, you could psychoanalyze it all you want to, it's a bunch of tree roots and gnarled forms, but it's amazingly modern and it's almost abstract as a design. It's fascinating to think that he's going in a new direction. Like, what would he have done? What could he have done if he had kept going? So, I mean, this is going to shake up a lot. If once this gets published more and people become more familiar with this work as, I don't know. I think they had it. I don't think they understood when it was. I think they've updated when they thought this was painted, and that gives it a new importance. So if this is July 1890, then that's a very different painting than this is of something from an earlier date that he was just playing around with. It suggests a new direction. So I don't know too much yet about it. I just, was reading about it. I just sort of
possibility it's phony.
No, I don't think so, because it's the Van Gogh Trust. These are the people that have control of his works, all his works. They know him better than anyone on this planet. So if it was another context, you'd have to wonder. But
Peggy,
yeah,
who names all these?
who names them?
Yeah. He doesn't
Yeah.
name them, does he? They're all somebody else's names, right?
No, he's probably named these. By the 19th century, artists are putting names on their works more often. I can't speak for sure about what Van Gogh named, if he named this one or not, that I don't know. But artists are naming their works in the 19th century, and titles are becoming important elements of a work of art.
Yeah, it was actually that last one that made me think that, when everything's getting dark again,
Right.
it's threatening sky,
Yeah,
it certainly expresses something.
absolutely. That's a troubled person, especially when the beautiful things he was doing 1 year earlier or 2 years earlier. Yeah, when you look at these, bright, yellow, sunny things, and now we jump down here and it's gotten dark. But then this is different. This is, I see a lot of Japanese influence in this, in terms of fabric design, Japanese lines, the details in the prints. I just see a lot of Japanese influence in this. Okay, so he shot himself, whatever painting he was working on at the time. He didn't come home that night, so the doctor went out and found him. He was still alive. Brought him back to the house, sent for his brother, Teo, to come down. Teo came down immediately. And so he lived for 3 days before he died. And his brother was with him. And, one of the things he said to his brother was that, he couldn't even shoot himself right. He just felt like he couldn't do, it's pathetic, but he really said that, like, I'm a failure. I couldn't even shoot myself. I think he shot himself in his stomach. Who shoots yourself in your stomach if you're going to commit suicide? That's just not smart. So Teo died very soon after, died in 91, just a few months after, and he was still young. People make a big deal out of that too, analyzing it, but he had a stroke. He was fairly young. He left a wife and young child, and the two brothers are buried side by side in Auvers, the town where the doctor lived. There were a number of retrospectives of his work in the early 20th century. He has a huge impact on the whole expressionist movements, as we'll see when we get to the 20th century. So yeah, we'll talk more about those exhibitions in the 20th century and how they affected that direction. But that gets us up to, next time we're going to talk about Gauguin, his circle, and the symbolists, and what that means and how that relates to the realists in this sort of battle. Does anybody have any questions about this at all?
Is this last painting the one that, or the one before is more expressionist?
Oh, they're both expressed. I think the last one is more, because it's more abstract.
I
Yeah.
have a question.
Yeah.
I'm just curious. This is a little off the subject, but that show that's coming about Van Gogh?
Oh, the big projections.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Has anybody been, or has it been here? Do you know?
Yeah, it's here, isn't it?
And I just started.
The small one that's out at the Starlight is here. The one
Yeah.
that we don't know where it's gonna be is not.
Oh, there's two of them. I didn't realize there were
Well, yeah,
two.
and nobody knows the date or the venue.
Oh.
so-
Apparently it's not well known.
Yeah, it's at Starlight. It's
Yeah.
long. I just wondered, it doesn't sound appealing to me.
There's been at least 2 movies about him before, right?
That's the other thing. And there was a movie.
Well, Kirk Douglas one.
No,
Right.
recent one following Doug Vincent or
William
Uh,
Defoe.
Yeah, I think that's what we.
Oh, yeah, I didn't see that one, but he looks like him too.
Yeah,
He does.
because it was more a drawing than it was an actual.
Yeah, the one where, and I missed that, but the one where it was just like his style. like
Yeah.
Everything was.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I missed that. I can't remember the name of it, but I've seen it. I saw that the original one with Kirk Douglas.
Yeah.
My God, he looks like him. It's just amazing. It's, I can see Willem Dafoe too, but
The one with Defoe, they represented Gauguin as a very, kind of like what you said, you know,
Kind of a jerk.
a jerk.
Yeah, he was kind of a jerk, but he's more than that. He's also a really intelligent guy.
Didn't he have another profession before?
Oh yeah, he was a banker,
Mhm.
a finance banker. He didn't even
You
start.
could be an intelligent jerk. I mean, that.
Yeah, in fact, a
Oh, there's
lot of
lots of them.
intelligent
A lot of
people are
those are
jerks.
jerks.
Yeah,
We had one as a president
Maggie?
for a while.
yeah, we had one for president for a while. I don't think he was that intelligent.
Oh, my, no.
Well, he was a
No.
con, so there's
Yeah.
some intelligence in there.
Yeah,
Peggy,
Never mind.
regarding the Douglas version, I know it's just Hollywood. Is there any truth? Because that movie suggested that it wasn't attempted suicide, that he was that he was feeling guilty, and that little boy shot him. Is there any?
I've seen no one putting forth that interpretation, and it's, yeah, so I don't know if there's any,
Controversy when people talk about it. Go, well,
not in India, not among art historians.
I know.
Art historians. I mean, the guy has been trying to kill himself for years. This time he picked up a gun, but he was self-destructive for forever. So I don't know that there's, I mean, how are we ever supposed to know? Nobody was there, you know? Nobody's ever gonna know what happened. But if he didn't kill himself at that moment, he would have done it soon anyway. He would have tried.
I have another question.
Yeah.
You know, you said you thought he was on the spectrum.
Yeah,
I think because of the epilepsy too, he had some visual sensory issues. And you notice how when somebody has seizures, they usually have an aura or something.
Yeah.
And colors come in and blah, blah, blah. I really think with his movement and the way he painted, there's a lot of visual sensory, how he saw.
that may be part of it. A number of nobody likes analyzing Van Gogh's conditions more than physicians and doctors. In fact, there have been numerous articles in AMA journals and other things about him. And a lot of them will talk about that. The only problem is they're totally ignoring the actual artistic tradition that he's coming from, which is leading him in this direction. I'm always leery of over medicalizing, because that's what they did in the 19th century. Everything was about a medical condition. You know, you paint this way in these colors because of this medical condition, when it's actually an artistic trend, and he's not the only one. So
Not necessarily.
I don't want to discount that could be that he had that, and that's part of it, but he's also very much part of what was happening in art. He was not an isolated or ignorant person. You know, he knew everything that was happening in Paris. He knew the styles. He was influenced by all the major artists. And so he's also making choices. So as long as we, you know, put both of those in there, then I'm good with the aura thing. That particularly people point out, like the lights in the night cafe, because they have a sort of aura around that.
Maybe he had glaucoma because he was seeing so many halos.
It's getting close. You know, I'm reminded of the impressionist who suffered from indigo mania. You know, that because you paint abstractly or distort a form, you have a medical condition that causes it. So I'm always
The
absinthe.
that he was drinking all along may have contributed to some of this.
Everything contributes. I mean, when you're suffering from malnutrition, absolutely everything is magnified 100-fold, which makes it impossible to ever know what was really the cause. I mean, we're never going to know, because you're piling on so many things, and then malnutrition, which just confuses every symptom. So it's just, you know, people, you know, it's fun to try and identify it, but we're never going to know, because there's just so many things all happening at the same time. But I also think it's really important that we don't over romanticize him or anybody else. He's just a guy. And there is a real tendency to over romanticize people like him. So does anybody have any other questions or comments or whatever?
I missed a couple, but in the past they had the painters had patrons that
Right.
and now there's art dealers and they're doing it for themselves.
Right, but
Correct.
some of them will have patrons, meaning someone who's collected a number of their works and might want to give them a little money to help them out in exchange for, you know, I want your next painting or something like that. So there is still, you know, it's not like
No,
there's
but-
not patrons out there helping artists once in a while. It's just not quite the same as it was before. But there are definitely cases, even well into the 20th century, where, you know, someone who really likes your work might, you know, help you out a little bit once in a while.
Sure.
So there's still a bit of that even today.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well then we'll say goodbye for today and see you
All right.
next week, and we'll
Thank you.
look at Gauguin and the symbolists.
Oh,
Thank you, Peggy.
Okay,
Bye-bye. Thank
you're
you.
welcome, everybody.
Thank you.